Welcome, folks, to our premiere episode of Climate Voices. I'm Bill Weihl, founder of ClimateVoice and former sustainability leader at Google and Facebook. We're going to run this show monthly. We're going to focus on policy aspects of climate and climate justice, exploring both the kinds of climate policy, legislation, regulation that can support a just transition, but especially what it will take to get the kinds of policies that we need. Check in on Facebook for future episodes and guests. One housekeeping note for anyone watching, we are recording this and we'll make it available later on our Facebook page and our YouTube channel. Be aware that any comments you make or questions you ask may be part of the recording. So my apologies for the late start. We had some technical difficulties, my fault. As a former Facebook employee, I should be particularly embarrassed. I am. So that's now on the internet forever. Today's show is about big tech and their deafening silence on climate policy. We're going to talk about how big tech, despite their pro-climate philosophy and the amazing things they're doing in their operations, in their supply chains, is not really showing up on Capitol Hill or in state capitals when it comes to climate policy. I'm honored to be joined today by Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who has been a champion for climate action and climate policy for years, and by Kendra Haven, the U.S. Engagement Manager for InfluenceMap and the lead author on their recent report on big tech and climate policy. So, Senator, let's just jump in. We will conclude, I should say, with Q&A from the audience. Please send or post questions to our Twitter account or on the Facebook event. Sorry again for the delay in getting started. And Senator, welcome. Thank you for joining us. A few weeks ago, you put an end to your weekly streak of making not quite the same speech on climate change, but an impassioned speech since 2012 to tell people and your fellow senators that it's time to wake up to climate change. At the end of this last speech, you dropped the mic and said it's time to get to work. So tell us about those speeches and why after 8 years it's come to an end.
Well, we covered an awful lot of topics in those speeches over those years, and part of it was the denial operation, the obstruction operation that the fossil fuel industry has run through a broad array of front groups so that they didn't have too many of their own oily fingerprints on what they were doing. And that was, of course, a great frustration to me because when I first got to the Senate, climate change was a bipartisan issue. And it only really became a partisan issue basically the month that Citizens United was decided and that the fossil fuel industry got this massive political weaponry that it instantly brought to bear on the Republican Party and shut down bipartisanship. So I've had all these years of frustration, and one frustration has been that people have not understood that this is not at its root a partisan issue. It is at its root a question of political power being used by an interest group to try to get its way. And the failure of corporate America to show up and push back on the fossil fuel industry operation has been enormously consequential, and particularly consequential for my Republican colleagues who listen to corporate America. And what's changed recently, and the reason I stopped my speeches, is that we've got a Biden administration that is truly committed to getting something really big done. You got Mitch McConnell out of the way as majority leader, so he can't block bills on the floor. And you've got, I think, the first signs of real interest in engaging politically on climate change from the rest of corporate America. And I got to give InfluenceMap huge credit for this change. They're reporting on the Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers and ranking them as the two worst climate obstructors in America went off like a bomb in corporate boardrooms of their members who did not want that badge. And nobody's denied it. It's absolutely true. And it's caused them to start to change dramatically. They're not the good guys yet, don't get me wrong, but they are starting to back off on their worst positions. And both through TechNet, the trade group that Silicon Valley operates through, and through the companies themselves, we've seen the same business of, we're not interested, we're not going to get involved on climate, we got other fish to fry with Congress, and by the way, we're going to be a member of trade associations that are actively stopping climate progress. So the net presence of corporate America, and in particular, the net presence of these five companies for the last decade in Congress has been negative, has been against the climate progress that they claim to espouse in their public facing operations.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things I've been saying, I'm not the only one, the last several years, is that companies like to position themselves as being neutral in these debates. That climate is not their issue. They're not an energy company, so it's not their place to get involved. But their silence is really complicity with those who are obstructing. And
Yep.
I think that's what I believe can
Yep.
change, will change in the coming.
Well, particularly when they're members of the organizations through which so much of the obstruction is being done.
Right, right. So let me turn to Kendra, just to introduce the report. So as I mentioned, Kendra Haven, she joined InfluenceMap in 2020. She was the lead author on their recent report. In the interest of disclosure, I should just mention, I am an advisor to InfluenceMap, and Ed Collins, their director of research on corporate lobbying, is on the advisory board for ClimateVoice. So we are connected to each other. We talk. I think we are in agreement that companies, and especially the big tech companies, can and should step up and do much more to support climate policy, to help us get the really bold policies that will drive decarbonization across the entire economy, not just in their own operations. So Kendra, maybe you could start by just telling us a little bit about InfluenceMap, what its mission is, what its purpose is, and then summarize the report for us.
Sure, thanks. Thanks, Bill, for having me on. So, InfluenceMap was founded in 2015 to track and analyze corporate influence over the climate policy agenda and to provide this information to investors and others. So, while other groups look at companies' business plans and operational commitments to reduce emissions, we run a global database with objective information on how companies and their industry associations are influencing climate change policy around the world. We wanted to apply our methodology to big tech specifically, given how much economic clout these five companies have accumulated, including during COVID-19 when other sectors have suffered and declined. This report on big tech and climate policy analyzed the extent to which these five companies are wielding their economic clout to advance climate policy globally, with a particular look at their activity in the US. The findings suggest that the companies are all highly positive in their top line support for climate policy, for example, supporting the Paris Agreement or the European Green Deal, but their detailed lobbying beneath that is limited, and it's far outweighed by the highly active and highly negative lobbying of some of their industry associations, like the US Chamber of Commerce. At the same time, what their direct lobbying leaves out are so many other forms of climate policy, like emissions reduction mandates and clean transportation, that we're just not seeing their engagement on.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck in the report that I think the numbers were 4% of big tech's climate lobbying activity was on climate, and we don't know, we don't have the details to say exactly which side they were on, but I think we can assume based on their statements that they were mostly lobbying for useful climate policy. Big oil, I think, was 32%. Is that right? Of their activity was on climate-related things.
Even higher, 38%.
38.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
quite
I'm
high.
sorry, I had the wrong
Yeah.
number. Right.
Quite
And
high, yeah.
in California, the difference was even starker. The other thing that struck me is, my sense is that big oil spends a lot more money on lobbying overall. So 38% of big oil's activity is much more than 10 times big tech's 4%. So that 4 versus 38 is a big difference, but it's even bigger when you look at how much actual total money they put into lobbying. Can you say a little bit more detail? I mean, you mentioned that there's sort of top line, they support the Paris Agreement, the European Green Deal. What are some of the kinds of policies, maybe you could talk about at the state level, where companies have had opportunities to show up but have failed to show up?
Yeah, sure. So for this report, we isolated a list of about 50 policies in the states to just look at as an example to see if we are finding big tech engagement. And these are the states where the companies all host their major operations. What we found is that they've engaged with climate policy in less than half of those states. And most of their engagement is related to very technical rules around corporate renewable procurement, for example, engaging with green tariffs or other measures that allow them to source renewable energy. What we're not seeing is, for example, California's upcoming landmark policy on building energy efficiency that would outlaw natural gas in new buildings. So those types of climate policies we are seeing other companies engage on. Big tech does not appear to have spoken up on those. And we see that, of course, at the federal level too, but the states was an interesting case study given that there's been significantly more legislation in the states over the last few years.
Like I said, the last 4 years, there certainly wasn't much positive climate policy on the agenda at the federal level, though plenty of stuff that was going in the wrong direction, perhaps, that companies could have been more vocal and lobbying against. Senator, I'm curious, when you see the big oil companies or the trade associations showing up, what would you like to see the big tech companies and others doing that they're not? How would you like them to show up?
Well, one thing that they could do is to demand, when they're members of the big trade associations that have been enemies of climate action, they could demand disclosure by those trade associations of the money that they've taken from the fossil fuel industry in the last decade. NAM and the Chamber are desperate not to have to reveal that, for I think the obvious reason that it would almost certainly reveal that they've taken tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars from the fossil fuel industry, and without telling their regular members, have turned themselves into a weapon for the fossil fuel industry. And until InfluenceMap came along and blew that up in this very public way, they were getting away with it. So a little bit of disclosure about what money they've taken and how they've used it would be important. I think it's also important to just, show up and start to make this important. The one thing that I'll say, in addition to what Kendra said about the difference in the spending, it's not just quantitative, it's also qualitative. If you are an oil industry lobbyist, you can come in and in your $100 worth of lobbying, you can say to a member of Congress, we are going to crush you if you cross us on climate. And that will be a very credible threat for that $100, because you've got all of these political organizations out there. You've got huge dark money electioneering operations out there. You have weaponry to enforce your will that is proven to be dedicated to this particular task. For $100, in comes one of the tech companies and they say, we really think you should do something about climate change. And they've got no clout. They've allowed themselves to be represented by groups that are on the wrong side. They don't have any weaponry to push back. So, the mafia guy comes into your store and he says, be a shame if anything were to happen around here. And you're going to take that in a certain way. A kid comes into your store with a balloon and says, I'd like some help for the school picnic fund. And you're going to look at that very differently. And so you have to see them different in quality as well as in quantity, because the oil and fossil fuel lobbying is part of that larger apparatus that they have built to try to cow and intimidate Congress politically.
So it sounds like it's not just them saying, we care about this, we want you to vote this way or whatever, but it's about actually, they have muscle that they use.
Yeah, they'll make good on threats. And it's not clear that the tech industry, when it comes in, is going to do anything more than check a box so that it can say that it lobbied on climate and then walk out, but not put its shoulder to the wheel to actually get anything done.
But I assume that when they're lobbying on an issue that they feel is really material core to their business, that they put their shoulder to the wheel, right?
Yeah, and in my small world of Congress, it's like a little ecosystem in which you know who the super predators are, and you can recognize the behavior, and people understand the difference between nominal lobbying or on the put yourself on the record lobbying, and lobbying where there'll be real consequences from that company if you don't adhere to what they want you to do. And the fossil fuel industry is probably the most threatening and politically violent of all of the industries. Nobody quite matches them.
Right. Interesting. So why, I'm curious, both of you, Senator, maybe you can start based on your experience. Why do you think tech companies have not been engaged in lobbying on climate? For the, were they before Citizens United, or was the issue that the intensity, sort of the protection racket on the other side got much bigger after Citizens United?
There was a moment after Speaker Pelosi passed cap and trade when there was a corporate rush to come into Congress, which I describe as the pie slicing effort. Corporate America thought that something big might happen, and they wanted to make sure that they got their piece of that thing. But once the Obama White House and the Harry Reid Senate decided not to do anything on climate and left Speaker Pelosi out to dry, they all walked away because there was no pie any longer for them to slice up. Since then, they did nothing, and I think there are a couple of reasons. First of all, they've got their own issues of tax and of trying to get, foreign engineers allowed in, and privacy issues, and a lot of stuff that is more immediate than climate. They also knew that there were people in Congress who were so tied to the fossil fuel industry that they would likely punish them if they raised climate as an issue. There would be adverse consequences, so stay away. And then they made a reasonable judgment that with Mitch McConnell as majority leader and Trump as president, why take the hit when you're not likely to get anything done anyway? So the fact that Mitch McConnell is out as leader, Trump is out as president, and we now have a clear field, this will be the real test of their sincerity about coming forward and getting something done in Congress. And just by the way, if you don't get something done in Congress, you don't get enough done. I have yet to see a single plan or model that says we can come anywhere close to handling climate change with purely voluntary corporate activities. It just isn't going to happen. The road to survival leads through Congress. And so it's not only a test of them whether they now show up and make an effort, it's essential that they do that if we're going to get through this climate crisis.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of activity at the state level, California, Massachusetts, New York, others. Actually, I'm ashamed to say I don't know what Rhode Island has done. My apologies for that.
We're doing well.
That's great. And we're seeing, with the Transportation and Climate Initiative, which is beginning to move now on the East Coast, we're seeing a range of things happening state level, regional, but we need economy-wide changes. We need it worldwide, not just in the U.S., but with the U.S. lagging, it's really hard for the world to move. So I would agree. And I run into lots of colleagues in Silicon Valley and tech companies who focus on the great things the companies are doing, which are
great.
They are great.
Concede that
point, they're not enough. And
they're not enough where it matters.
Right. So I think let's talk for a few minutes if we could, and I think maybe both of you could weigh in on this. But what are the kinds of policies? 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when we were looking at cap and trade, there was a big focus on one overarching policy. What are the kinds of policies that you think make sense over the next year or two to try to push through Congress and through the executive branch and at the state level?
Well, I'd put a couple of buckets out there. One bucket is the stuff we have to do to cope with what we've already done to ourselves through climate change. which is going to be a lot of coastal resilience, a lot of wildfire issues. It's going to be dealing with species. It's all the stuff that we've already wrecked that we now have to try to get back to somewhat normal. The second is we got to offset the huge subsidy that fossil fuel floats on. International Monetary Fund says it's $600 billion a year just in the United States and trillions around the world. So if we don't make the fossil fuel industry pay for the harm that it's causing, it's going to be a long, long, long and uphill struggle to get out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves. And then the third bucket is all of the smaller and more technical stuff that we can do to build in the right direction, to build an EV infrastructure, to change the grid, to modernize it, to fix the tax structure so that people are incented to put solar up on their roofs, to do all the things that activate individual action and the transformation of technologies.
Yeah. Kendra, your thoughts on policies, maybe particularly at the state level?
Yeah, well, I think it's worth noting just from the broad perspective that what we're seeing from government level at the government level is net zero commitments and companies lining up to support those net zero commitments. But what the most recent reporting from the UN shows is that unless those net zero commitments are backed up by detailed policies, we won't achieve them, and we're going to exceed warming of 3 degrees. So for that reason, that's why at InfluenceMap we look at the detailed lobbying to back up net zero ambition overall. And we are seeing companies lobby in the US, in the EU on all kinds of policies that are meant to drive and deliver that net zero ambition.
Yeah, and net zero, I think that too much, I would say I'm hearing net zero, and that means a huge reliance on offsets, which might be of dubious impact or quality in the near future, and too much of an assumption that we will have some miraculous technology in 10 or 20 or 30 years that sucks carbon out of the air and magically solves the problem. We have to cut emissions in half, more or less, in the next decade, and that means, starting yesterday, massive deployment. I think, as Senator, you were saying, wind, solar, EVs, EV infrastructure, heat pumps. I'm sitting in a house with, natural gas for the heating and hot water and stove, and we need to stop burning fossil fuels in buildings. That requires just enormous change across the economy. Okay, sorry. Had a thing that I could not mute quickly enough. I'm curious what companies you folks have seen, if any, that you would classify as leaders on this. The big 5 tech companies obviously are huge. Their market cap is enormous. They have they can have enormous influence if they choose to use it. But who have you seen that really has been visible, active, using their influence on climate policy, state and or federal level?
It's been mostly, in my experience, very small companies. Patagonia has really leaned in very hard. For instance, I think the Outdoor Industry Association, as a trade association, is probably the strongest, because all of their athletes and participants are so full of the experience of what climate change is doing that they're highly, highly and genuinely motivated. We're starting to see the financial sector take this more seriously, because the warnings about the carbon bubble collapsing and taking out the whole economy are so strong. And we're seeing coastal interests beginning to rally a bit, because they've seen Freddie Mac's warning separately about coastal property values crashing and taking out the economy as well. So I would say that ag is starting to get very worried, because it hits their business plan right in the heart. I would say that the finance and banking sectors are starting to get very, very worried. And if you look at ag and if you look at Wall Street, those are groups that know how to get their way in Congress when they want to. So the fact that they have done nothing so far is consequential, because they're not Patagonia. Patagonia can throw everything it's got at this problem, and it just, it's inspiring, but it's not the same as if Big Ag or Wall Street came into Mitch McConnell's office and said, son, we're all done with you until we get some carbon pricing here, until we get a significant climate bill, until we get what we need. And they're not saying that. The banks lobby much harder on getting out of the restrictions we put out on them after the 2008 meltdown. The ag companies lobby mostly about tax. Again, those things are changing, but they're still on the wrong side. They're just less on the wrong side. So that change needs to accelerate.
Kendra, Annie, from the analysis that you folks have done at InfluenceMap, who are some of the leaders you would identify?
We name a couple leaders in the report, one of which is Unilever. We actually have a metric that analyzes the intensity or the frequency of lobbying, which we consider strategic lobbying on climate. And unsurprisingly, it's twice the size for fossil fuel companies. It's also nearly twice the size for Unilever compared to big tech, which really shows just starkly the difference in how strategically frequently they're lobbying on climate. And we see Unilever lobbying on some of the policies that tech companies left out, like the major legislation in California, ending fossil fuel subsidies, vehicle emission standards in the EU, just really specific examples of climate policies that we didn't see any engagement from with the big five.
Yeah. And I think, I guess.
Let me echo Kendra on Unilever. DSM, I think it was called Dutch State Mining originally, is also lobbying quite hard on this. Unilever's way out front on ocean plastics as well. It's funny that the companies that seem to have a European base and a European market seem much more responsive. And my thesis on that is that they're not used to being able to come to Congress and bully their way around. So they got to think further ahead and be more responsible. And that may explain the difference. But it's really distinct how on not only climate issues, but ocean plastics issues, the European companies are well ahead of the American companies. It's a little bit unfortunate to see. Bill, I think we lost your volume.
I'm sorry. So we did.
There we go.
This is not my day for technology, I got to say. We have a couple of questions coming in from Facebook and Twitter. From Michael, a question about, can we expect a big federal climate bill this year? If so, what will it look like? And when can we expect to see it really begin to take shape in the US Congress?
So here's my theory on that. We're going to do the COVID bill. That'll probably be done within 2 or 3 weeks. We really want to get that finished up to the floor, done, agreed on, signed by the president. The next big piece of legislation is going to be the Biden administration Build Back Better plan, which is going to be primarily infrastructure, but it is going to have a massive green infrastructure component to it. And we are going to work in that process to see how much other more regulatory or economic policy on climate we can fit into that bill. But because we want to get it done fairly quickly, I would hazard for sure before the August recess, at some point that bill is just going to close up and we're going to pass it and it's going to have boatloads of climate stuff, but it may not get us to 1.5 degrees. It may still flunk nature's test of whether we've succeeded at this. So then we roll on to Glasgow in November, and that tees up an international consensus, I hope, a much stronger consensus than Paris. And that helps frame what we can most effectively do going forward. And then we have one more, what we call reconciliation bill, one more bill that we can pass with the majority we have in the Senate in the following year. So we get a second bite to do whatever climate stuff we couldn't get done in Build Back Better. I think that's the way this likely rolls out. And but we may get, who knows? Things may just break right, and we may be able to get Build Back Better done. But this is where the corporate support matters. The fact that corporate support isn't there now makes it hard for Build Back Better to go very far, because it will have no Republican support, because the fossil fuel industry will be quarreling with us and the corporate sector won't be helping. So we'll probably just have to, jam that through with a little bit lower expectations than we could if corporate America was really engaged. And then they've got a year to get their act together and show up for the next bill, would be the way that might work. But we're going to do big stuff in this Congress, and I think probably in 2 major climate bills.
And related to that, you mentioned that, if you don't get Republican votes, you've got 50 Democrats plus.
We do reconciliation.
You do reconciliation, which limits, I guess, I'm not an expert on rules of reconciliation, but does it limit what you can do to some extent?
It does. Makes it hard to do things like a clean electricity standard that aren't either spending or revenue raising. Makes it easy to do carbon pricing because that's revenue raising. Makes it easy to build stuff because that's spending. But the regulatory stuff in the middle is hard to pull off.
So if big tech is really going, one of the questions that came in, if big tech is really going to put its shoulder to the wheel, can they exert enough clout to offset the threats wielded by the fossil fuel industry? And if so, what would that look like? I'm thinking about, to move 10 Republican votes, for example, in the Senate. What would big tech and other companies have to do? My hope would be if big tech really stepped up, other major companies, in ag and healthcare, finance and so on might join them. But we need to get some leaders to really step up. What would that look like?
Yeah, that's been the problem, because companies haven't been willing to step forward, because they've been afraid of getting smashed in the face if they step forward by either the fossil fuel industry or the Republicans that the fossil fuel industry controls in Congress. There hasn't been that kind of catalytic moment for people to come together. I'm hoping that the Biden administration will call corporate leaders together to have that catalytic moment, because you really can't punish all of big tech, all of Wall Street, all of big ag, the consumer-facing companies, if they all come in together and if they're deadly serious and say to the Republicans, look, if you guys want our support, then you're going to have to, this is your moment. You're going to have to perform. We're not going to put up with any more of this. And if they say it together, it's really, really hard. Like herd protection, it's really hard to punish them all. So I think it's very, very important that the tech sector not only get its own act engaged in this next critical year, but that it also have a plan to engage with these other major sectors and get them all pulling together. A lot of the pieces are out there through Climate Leadership Center Council, through Business Roundtable, through Series, through what's it called, C2ES. There are lots of organizations, but they haven't really coalesced, come together, developed their plan, and stepped up onto the field.
That does seem like something the big tech companies, if they wanted to, they could lead.
It's the kind of stuff that they're good at.
Right. Kendra, can you talk a little bit about the Chamber of Commerce and other associations, given the analysis that you guys have done, and how their at least their statements on climate are shifting? What's the trajectory there, and what do you think we can hope to see?
We've published a lot of analysis on industry associations since we started in 2015, and especially in the last few years. As the senator mentioned, in 2019, our research found that the National Association of Manufacturers and the Chamber of Commerce were at the very top of the list for negative and influential groups. But beyond that, the 7 out of the 10 highly influential and negative trade associations were all based in the US, which paints the picture of trade association influence here. We've seen groups posture positively in the past in response to pressure. The Chamber has done this in its reversal on the Paris Agreement, when the Trump administration's decision was essentially already made. Um, After its reversal, it continued to oppose clean car standards last year. And just a few weeks ago, the chamber did get some really great press for saying that it supports durable climate policy and market based climate policy. These are top line positions that we do consider more positive, but to get the full picture of the influence of a company or an industry association like the chamber, we consider the top line with the detailed lobbying together. And within a week of updating its position, the chamber is already opposing some of the key tenets of Biden's climate plan, and hosting joint press conference with the American Petroleum Institute to massage its messaging.
Yeah.
And the chamber doesn't just work on Congress, it's also active in regulatory agencies filing comments. It also is involved in litigation. And in every single appearance that it makes that relates to the environment or climate, it is taking the position of the fossil fuel industry. So it's going to be a big, big tanker to turn around, assuming that it's even real and not a maneuver.
Well, they've changed their rhetoric over the years from what was really outright denial 10 years or 8 years ago to not quite denial, but certainly what seems like delay. And I think that is the big question: is will it be real, or will it be nice top level statements and then continuing to lobby against the specific policies we need? I want to turn to one last topic, which is around environmental justice and more broadly the intersecting wide range of intersecting justice issues. A lot of people these days are talking about climate not just as a technical problem of emissions, but really one of economic justice, racial justice, environmental justice. How important, Senator, do you feel it is, and how likely do you think it is? Certainly the Biden administration is talking about environmental justice in many of the things it's been doing. How likely do you think it is that will be a central component of what gets done over the next year?
Very high. The Biden administration has lit this up as a priority. And I think if you get involved in things like carbon pricing, where you have enormous revenues suddenly made available, it gives you tools to do some pretty remarkable things to bring about environmental justice and to clean up poisoned places and to make sure that the response to climate change is also a positive economic response and a positive justice response. And I think they've really been effective at adding that to the list of core priorities in getting this done. Obviously, priority one still has to be 1.5 degrees. You know, nature will flunk us if we don't hit that. And there's no amount of, getting all the political groups lined up that will excuse our failure in that regard. But we have so much flexibility in how we get there, and we have so many revenue prospects that I think not only is it important to press for environmental justice, it's also extremely, extremely doable. This is its moment. And I couldn't be more pleased and proud that the Biden administration has pushed this to the forefront.
Yeah, that makes sense. And certainly in an era with COVID where the government, for very good reason, is spending enormous sums of money to help people and businesses stay afloat, spending that money in a way that actually helps create more just outcomes seems like a no-brainer.
Yeah.
So we're getting close to the end. I just want to thank both of you for being here. Reiterate just the major finding of the InfluenceMap report, and I think the experience that you've been relating, Senator, which is that big tech and other big companies have been mostly just absent when it comes to climate policy over the last decade.
At least in Congress. Abandon hope, all ye who enter here.
And there are signs maybe that's beginning to change. I think we can hope that it will. I want to give each of you just a final word to say something particularly about what is, for the people who are listening, especially the employees of tech companies or students who might one day be employees, what's one thing they could do to push their company to do something much more positive about climate policy. Senator, I'll start with
Kendra, you want to go ahead?
No, Kendra, you can go.
Sure. I think I'm feeling hopeful that there's increasing attention to an understanding of corporate climate influence, and I think that can help clear the way for climate policy in itself, including the push for transparency around it. So, as an employee, I think it's just a matter of taking that issue as separate from operational plans to work from the inside.
I'd say two things. One, raise hell within your company, obviously, appropriately. But I think it's going to be really important for the people up in the C-suites to hear that this is coming from everywhere and that their employees are up in arms as well. The other thing that I would add that we haven't really talked about much is that to the extent that you're working for a company that plays politically with dark money, that makes anonymous donations or makes donations to political entities that hide who their donors are, that's the reason we are where we are. That's how climate denial and obstruction was enabled. It was enormous amounts of anonymous money that would influence politics without any blowback showing that it was fossil fuel money. So one thing that you can do is to really take on the whole question of dark money, the corrupting and toxic nature of it, and make sure that in addition to cleaning up the climate act of the company, it has forsworn anonymous political money.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. It's clear that we've got a huge problem, a gap that has been in DC and in state capitals for the last decade, but also a huge opportunity for companies to step up. It's also, for me, having come from the tech industry, it's clear that tech employees and young people in general are passionate about climate, want to see their companies do more. I hope that this show that we've done will help educate people about actually how important it is for companies to show up on climate policy and really use their influence, not, as you said, Senator, do what's essentially performative lobbying, showing up saying, we care, thanks for listening, but using their influence and saying, we really, really care, and it will affect how we donate, where we build new facilities, everything else that a senator or representative might care about. So folks, expect to hear more from tech employees in the coming weeks and months about how they want their companies to do more on climate. I think there's going to be a lot more activity on that coming from us at ClimateVoice and from other organizations. I should mention the group Change the Chamber, a group of a coalition of student groups around the country, has been pushing companies that are members of the chamber now since last July, I think, to get the chamber to change its stance. I think they've had some impact on where the chamber has gone, but we all need to, as you said, Senator, companies need to hear this from all directions and really, really loudly. So thank you both. And with that, we're done. See everybody next time.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kendra.
Bye, thanks.